Anybody not using a database automation tool currently? Everybody's got automated database deployments? It's okay, it's a safe place. Partially? Okay. Still got somebody, clicking the button, perhaps? Cool. Any other questions people have or things they want to talk about? Yeah. Something better than migrations. Uh-oh. What's that?
A document database.
Document database? Anybody else got anything that they want to talk about? So what tools are you guys using today? Those of you who have database automation. Any framework? Anybody else got anything else besides EF? SQL scripts? Cool. Liquid base? Okay, cool. Does anybody here use Flyway by chance? Handful? Cool. We'll be doing a live demo of Flyway, so hopefully the demo gods are with me today and the internet. But if not, we do have a recording, so that's worst case scenario. All right, so it's 10:20, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Scott, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Devops for databases. I have already posted these slides up on my blog, which is my first and last name, scottsauber.com, and you can follow me on Twitter, just Scott Sauber there as well. So before we get started, I just want to kind of level set on what we're going to be talking about today. That way, if this isn't kind of what you're expecting, you can go check out another NDC talk. You won't hurt my feelings or anything like that. So we're really trying to target developers or DBAs who want to automate their database deployments, because I find a lot of companies, and we'll talk about the statistics on that a little bit later, don't have any database automation at their companies, or sometimes people just don't really know where to get started. They might have a little bit of automation, but then they're still stuck doing some manual steps. So just a quick poll, like how many developers do we have in the room? Okay, like 3/4, 80% of the room. How many DBAs do we have? 1. Okay, it's not shame the DBA in the room. Any managers? Handful. Okay, cool. And everybody else, maybe you partied a little too hard last night, so you didn't want to raise your hand. That's totally fine.
Everybody else doing.
So we're going to talk about all these different topics today. We're going to talk about what choices you need to make, what are the trade-offs of the different options, like we talked about migration-based approaches, and we'll talk about model-based approaches as well. What tools are out there, what challenges you will face, both technical and political/organizational. And I'll do a live demo using Flyway and GitHub Actions here in a little bit, along with Docker. And I'll take questions at the end. So my goals for you in this talk is just ramp up on how to implement automation to your databases using the various technologies we've kind of touched on, and know the options and trade-offs for all the different approaches and tools that you have at your disposal. So who am I? I'm the director of engineering at a software consulting company called Lean Techniques. As you can probably tell by my accent, I'm from the US. We're based in Des Moines, Iowa, which is kind of the center of the US. I'm also the co-organizer of the Iowa.NET user group. I've automated dozens of databases now. I'm a friend of Redgate, and I blog as well. All right, let's dive in. So I've worked with Fortune 100 companies all the way down to startups and being in consulting, and I typically see 3 main manual workflows when people have database changes. The first one is the developers write, review, and deploy the SQL all themselves. Second one is the developers write the SQL, but then hand it off to a DBA, perhaps, to review and then deploy the SQL. Or the third one, and I see this one less often, but developers tell DBAs what they want, then the DBAs write, review, and then deploy the SQL. Just curious, a show of hands, how many people have DBAs in their organization? All right, maybe like 1/3 of the room? Okay, cool. So what's a manual workflow look like today? It's usually one of two things. I either see like what I call the compare approach, where you do a bunch of development on your database, and then you use a tool like SQL Compare or pgadmin to compare the changes that you've made to create a SQL script for you, essentially. And you take that SQL script and deploy it to prod however you do that today. Or there's what I call the gather SQL scripts approach, where you accumulate all these SQL scripts and then hand it off to somebody like maybe a team lead, or maybe you have access to production, and eventually you run those scripts against production. So what's wrong with these manual approaches? Well, the first thing is you don't have any source control. You have no traceability of who did what, when did they do it, how did they do it. You've got none of that because everything is manual. And manual obviously leads itself to being really tedious. Like, how many people have deployed a SQL script manually before? Most of the room. Keep your hand up if that was your favorite part of your job. Nobody, right? Like, nobody actually likes manually deploying stuff. And it's easy for somebody to make mistakes. Like, how many people have ran a SQL script against the wrong environment before? Yep. A lot of people who previously had their hand up put their hand up again, and everybody else who kept their hand down is probably a liar, but that's okay. As well as this script order can get out of whack, because you might have like a create table and then an alter table script, and you might run one of those out of order. So that's another issue with manual deployments, is that script order can totally get out of whack. As well as your development database that you're working against and your production database could be out of sync. So how many people have to deal with store procedures or views or functions or things like that? Probably half the room, right? So those of you who have dealt with those things know that the last one in wins, right? So if you're making a change to a store procedure or view or function or any of those types of things, if you don't have the latest changes in your development environment, you could potentially be overriding somebody else's changes. So there's no forced continuous integration where you're continuously integrating your changes with other people's changes. All right, so that's kind of like level setting, like what's the problem with manual database deployments. So let's talk about what DevOps is here real quick. So this is probably my favorite definition of what DevOps is. It's by Donovan Brown from Microsoft. He said, DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. I just want to focus on two different sections here. This first section, talking about people, process, and products. So if you don't have people bought into a DevOps mindset, you will struggle implementing like DevOps pipelines throughout your organization. And then you also need the process. So you need to know what all needs to happen in order for us to deploy something to production. And then finally, the easiest part, honestly, is the tools, the products, the things that actually do the automation. That is honestly the easiest part of these three, because the tools are proven over time, and when you've got some cultural things going on, that can be a bit of a challenge. As well as I like to focus on this part too, value to our end users, right? Like, the only reason why any of us in this room have a job and are here today is because presumably we're adding value to our end users, right? And that's something I like to focus on when you're dealing with some of these organizational challenges, is at the end of the day, what we're trying to get out of this is value to our end users to deliver our software more frequently and more reliably. And I also like this quote by Julie Gunderson. She said, "You can't change culture and process with a credit card. You can't go to Microsoft or Google or anything like that and say, hello, I'd like one DevOps, please, and it just kind of works, right? You have to get your culture and your process bought into DevOps so you don't have people bypassing the pipeline, going directly to production, anything like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so how do we apply DevOps to databases? So I have these in order of importance, not necessarily the order in which you'll run things. But first off, get your database source controlled. So if you don't have your database in source control, just extract out all your DDL, drop it into source control, and that's like the very first step that you can do. Second most important thing is make database deployments at most a single click of a single button. I have a bit of an extreme take that I would rather just deploy straight to production, assuming you have automated tests in place that give you that feedback, that confidence that everything's green. Because at the end of the day, if your CI pipeline is green and you're not deploying to production, that means you've got a confidence gap, right? And we need to fill that confidence gap. And usually what I find is that confidence gap can be filled with automated tests. So that when you're green and when your CI pipeline's green, you should be confident to be able to deploy all the way out to production. But at most, database deployments should be a single click of a single button. And then you also want database builds to verify each commit. So you want to test out your migrations and make sure that everything's good to go as well. All right. So Redgate runs a survey called the State of Database DevOps Survey, and this is from 2021. So I'll have you look at those numbers here real quick. So we're going to talk about a few of these. So first one we're going to talk about is version control. So if you notice, the red bar is for databases or for applications, and the black bars are for databases. So for version control, 85% of applications have source control. I just want to pause there for a second. Like, does that terrify anybody else that 15% of applications out there aren't even in source control? Like, when I saw this, I'm like, that has to be wrong, but it wasn't. So anyway, tangent, back to databases. So you can see databases are lagging behind applications at 62%. Now, I will say, keep in mind, this is a survey put on by Redgate. Redgate makes tools for databases, right? So I would honestly take these numbers and cut them all in half, because the people responding to this survey probably are more likely to have database automation than your just average company. And I would say 80% of the companies I talk to don't have database automation in place at all, and then most of them don't have database automation across their entire application suite. So that's one area that we're going to be talking about is version control. Another one we're going to be talking about is automated builds. So 64% of applications have automated builds compared to 36% of databases. Again, slice that in half, I'd probably say 18% of databases have automated builds. And then the last part, 41% of applications have automated deployments, and 28% of databases have automated deployments. Again, slice that in half, probably more like 14%. So why is this hard? Like, for those of you who don't have this across the board, like, why don't you have this across the board? What makes databases so much harder than applications?
Well, traditionally the tools are not there to do it.
Right.
The main reason, and also DBAs are have a different mindset to developers. You've got this, split between the developers and the DBAs, and the DBAs want scripts in their traditional format, and you're kind of, in a way, maybe doing them out of a job as well. They're very conservative, very risk-averse, don't like new stuff.
Yep.
Those are the main reasons.
So I just want to summarize for people who couldn't hear. There's a few things there. Tooling, isn't first-class citizen for databases oftentimes. And then DBAs, they have a different way of working than developers. They might feel like they're getting cut out of the process. Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Values in the data. If you screw up the data, you've lost all the value.
Yep. Values in the data. If you screw up the data, you've lost all the value. Absolutely.
More of a reason to keep it in source control. It's scary.
Yep. Absolutely.
It's your story of state at the end of the day. Like, if you have file formats you're saving out an application, instead you have as many nightmares trying to up-version file loading routines and stuff as well.
Yep. Yeah. If you mess up your data, you're in a bad spot for sure. Yeah. Quick fixes? Yep. So getting hot fixes out are faster, just going directly to production versus having a pipeline. Yep. Yeah. So when you're saying version mismatches, are you talking about like the database engine itself, like what version of SQL Server you're running on, or okay? Yep. Yeah.
I think one of the big reasons is also that development teams actually spend a long time organizing their work with Scrum or whatever, trying to get more efficient all the time. And at least my experience from the financial sector, where we are sort of separated, developers are separated from the production environments, and DBAs are typically in the production environment part of the organization, and they don't do these things. So they are not continuously improving as a way of life.
Yep. So there's a rift between developers and DBAs, separate teams, and they just work differently.
Yeah, I haven't heard about Scrum for DBAs or other ways of
Or
continuously
version control or anything like that. That's, they're focused on, database indexes and, I don't know, provisioning disks and all this. Version controls are not on their radar.
Yep. Yeah, version control is definitely not first thought for databases.
Between a terrorist and a DBA, you can negotiate with the terrorist.
Nice.
And developers hate to do the same thing twice, and DBA loves to do the same thing over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I had a lot of the same reasons you guys did. So as we talked about, on the previous slide, 72% of companies don't have automated builds and deploys, because only 28%, according to the survey, had automated deploys. And again, I would probably say that's light. So as we kind of talked about, source control is not traditionally built into database tools like SQL Server Management Studio, PG Admin, Data Grip, some of those. It's not traditionally been a first-class citizen like it is in application IDEs like Visual Studio Code, Writer, WebStorm, all those. As well as how many people have dealt with link servers? All right, keep your hand up if you like link servers.
I do, yeah.
One person likes link servers. All right, we won't haze you too bad then. As well as people do things like database hopping, right? Where you hop from like one database to the other and like query across multiple databases. Those things can also be challenging when you're implementing a database DevOps pipeline. And as we kind of touched on earlier, like this requires devs and DBAs to come to some sort of agreement, right? And talk to each other. And our industry isn't exactly known for communication and collaboration and knocking that out of the park. As well as, we talked about this too. DBAs think that they're getting cut out. But spoiler, they're not, right? Like we talked about earlier, how many people actually like running SQL scripts over and over and over again? Like I've talked to a lot of DBAs, that is not their favorite part of their job. It's performance tuning, adding indexes, designing database warehouses, like all that kind of stuff. It's not running SQL scripts over and over and over again. So we're actually freeing DBAs up to do more of what they like to do and adding more value to the organization than being the gatekeepers of the SQL scripts. Some other reasons, like what we talked about, the database is stateful, whereas applications are not, or at least shouldn't be, right? So if you need to roll back an application, right, like largely the process conceptually is blow away all these files and then replace them with the old ones, right? Whereas if you need to roll back a database, like everything requires a little bit of thought, right? Like what exact change did you make? Did you, add a new column? Okay, did anybody add data to that column that you need to keep track of that you want to drop after you drop the column, or whatever the case may be? Like everything's super contextual based on what that script was doing. And I will say it's a lot easier on greenfield databases. So if you're starting a brand new database, just start with database automation from the very get-go. Like don't try and backport it later. Just start from the very beginning with database automation because that just gets a lot easier versus when you're trying to backport it to databases. Like I've dealt with multi-tenant databases where there's like hundreds of customers with the same database schema in each, and there's even drift between the different customers' databases, and some of it was intentional. If we have time, I can dive into some of those stories a little bit later. But just from the very beginning, start with database automation. Don't put that aside. All right. let's start talking about how we apply the DevOps to databases. So what do we want to source control? We want to put the table, views, store procedures, any DDL, put that schema into source control. As well as any static data, this is something that some people don't think about, is any data that's needed for that application to run successfully, things like lookup data, like configuration, if you got feature toggles in a database, whatever roles, any lookup table data, get that stuff into source control as well. So how do you do this? We talked a little bit earlier about migration-based approaches, and there's also a concept of model-based approaches as well. So the model-based approach is basically like, hey, here's my ideal state of the database. The table should look like this. These store procedures should look like this, all that kind of stuff. And then basically the tool just figures out, okay, I need to make that production database look like that ideal model. So some examples of tools that do this: Redgate SQL Source Control, Microsoft DACPack. I don't prefer this approach, and the reason is you just lack a little bit of control at the end of the day. So think about things like column renames. I've seen some of these tools not be able to figure out how to rename a column and do something like a drop and an add, which obviously is not exactly what you wanted, more than likely. And I would say this approach is losing mindshare too to migration-based approaches. So this is where every change that you have is scripted, and then those scripts are committed to source control, and they're run in a very particular order. So I've seen scripts be like date-based. I've seen them be like just number version-based as well. And so you need to run these scripts in a very particular order. So your create tables happen before your alter tables. Oops. Ugh. And which scripts have been run are then kept track of in some sort of table. So we talked about ND Framework a little bit earlier. ND Framework has I think it's like _ EF migrations history table. A lot of these tools have the exact same thing, or the exact same concept. And this requires you to write them upfront during development and then run those exact same scripts in every single environment. So whatever environments you have between your local machine and production, you run those exact same scripts throughout all of those environments. So some examples of tools: Flyway is a good tool, and we'll demo that here in a little bit. It's a little bit more cross-platform, or platform agnostic, whether you're writing like C#, Java, JavaScript, whatever the case may be. If you're in .NET land, any framework migrations, DBUp, and Roundhouse are also all good options. As somebody mentioned Liquibase earlier, that's also another good option as well. And migration-based is my preferred approach over the model-based approach. So how do we source control the database? So this is where my opinions start to come in, and you might disagree with them, and that's totally okay. But in my opinion, if the database is only meant for one application, I want that database code and application code to live together in the same repository. This is assuming you don't have like a shared database shared across tons of different applications, right? So if you're in that more monolithic database scenario, I might lean towards ripping it out into its own separate repository. But if you have it all in the same repository, then you can look at one pull request, one commit for the application code and the SQL code. So you can see like, okay, I added this column, it's in my C# models, and this cascades down in this way. You can see that all in one single pane of glass versus having it in multiple repos and having to stitch that information together. And ideally, the final schema and the migrations live together as well. So with migrations, you kind of just see the deltas and the changes. And ideally, if you can get the final schema in there so you can kind of see what everything looks like, that would also be ideal. All right, so now we're going to talk about automated builds. So responsibilities of automated build is to take those migrations and deploy them to some independent database. Whether you have, you're spinning up a database on the fly with something like Docker, which we'll demo here in a little bit, or you have a database dedicated to CI. So this is trying to tell you whether or not your migrations are even valid. You use some sort of build tool, such as GitHub Actions, Azure Devops, Jenkins, TeamCity, Circle CI. There's tons of different build tools out there that you can use. All right, automated deployments, how do we do those? The responsibilities of an automated deployment is to take those migrations and deploy them to each environment. And the automated deployment step also swaps out any secrets, so things like connection strings. So that way you're not storing those connection strings in source control. You have them in your pipeline swapping in and out. You can use a deployment tool for that, things like Octopus Deploy, GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, Jenkins, TeamCity. The list goes on and on. All right, so if you aren't doing this today, and let's say you have DBAs in the mix, I'm going to propose a workflow as like a starting point, and then you can add and remove things as what makes sense for your organization. So the developer adds the application code and SQL code because they have the most context on what it is that they need. Developer commits that to a branch and sends a pull request for code review. Another developer reviews the application code. Possibly a DBA gets involved here if you have DBAs reviewing the SQL code. If you're on things like GitHub, they have like the code owners file saying, hey, anything in this folder needs to get reviewed by this person. So that's how you, or this group of people. So that's how you can get the DBAs involved. When both are approved, that code's merged into the main branch. That code is then built independently to verify that the commit that they just created was valid. And then deployments are, at most, again, a single button push. All right, we're going to test out the conference Wi-Fi here and see how things go. So I am going to demo Flyway using GitHub Actions and also primarily interacting with Flyway using Docker. So I guess to level set real quick, Flyway is just a CLI tool. So if you want, you can download it and install it, and you just run Flyway, and then there's a few different commands. I'm going to be executing those via Docker. So in this Docker compose file, I just have the database, which I'm just using Postgres here. My database is called a site to order stuff because I'm really creative and didn't know what to call it. And then I'm suffixing the environment there. And then I've got the Flyway image. So this pre-installs the Flyway CLI for me, so that way I don't have to install it on my machine. So you guys can pull this down if you just go to github.com/ my first and last name, Scott Sauber, and /database-devops, and I'll have a link at the end too. You can pull this down and run it. As long as you have Docker, everything should be good to go. So this Flyway image has Flyway pre-installed, and at the end of the day, we're calling Flyway migrate. But then you can pass Flyway a bunch of different options. So in this case, I guess I should ask, can everybody see that okay? Everybody in the back good? All right, awesome. So we're giving it a connection string here and telling it, hey, here's the database to connect to, here's the username and password, and then we're running migrate at the end of the day. So what migrate does is, this is looking for a folder called SQL, and then I just separated these by repeatable and versioned, and we'll talk about those here in a second. But what a version migration is this is something that you only want to run once, right? So with Flyway, how you tell something is versioned is you do v, and then you give it a number, and then do 2 underscores, and then you can give it whatever name you want. So I call this create_customers_table.sql. And so these are version migrations run in a very particular order. So I'll have like v1, then v2, then v3, or you can do like v1.1 or whatever the case may be. It'll just run in that very particular order, and then it'll write to a Flyway_schema_history table. And we'll take a look at that here in a second. But then Flyway also has the concepts of repeatable migrations. So first, Flyway will run all of the version migrations, and then it will run repeatable migrations. And so repeatable migrations are good for things like views, store procedures, functions, things that you can run over and over and over again. And those run after you run the version migrations. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and crack open CLI here. Can everybody see that, hopefully? Good to go? All right, so I'm just going to run docker compose up. And so what this will do is so if you want to pull this down, I actually don't want to echo out all of the logs. I'm going to run this in detach mode. So what this will do is it will spin up my DB database here, the Postgres database, and then it will spin up Flyway and execute those migrations against Flyway. So if I come over here and look at the logs, oh, sorry, I need to docker compose. Not sure why those logs haven't shown up yet. just going to restart this, do Docker compose down, bring everything back down, and then run this again. So I should see some Flyway logs here. Okay, I'm not sure what happened right there. But so this is my Postgres database standing up, just telling me, hey, I'm ready for connections. And then this is Flyway actually running here. So you can see it said, hey, I found 2 migrations. I didn't have a Flyway schema history table, so I went ahead and created that. And then I ran these 2 migrations, and I've successfully applied those migrations. So if I come over here and look at my database, so this one over here is the localhost. You can see I've got a customers table here, and if I look, you've got the 3 columns that I specified earlier. And if I look at the Flyway schema history table here, you can see it's recording like, hey, here's the migrations that ran, here's version 1, here's a description, which is just the name of the file with spaces where the underscores were. Here's a SQL name. Here's the checksum. So a nice feature is you can't ever change a version migration after it's been ran. So if I went into one of these SQL files and that I'd already ran and tried to change it, Flyway would yell at me and say, hey, you already tried to change this, right? So if I wanted to add another column, for instance, I can't do that on my original script. I have to create a new script that's doing like an alter table, right? And that's just telling me, hey, who installed it, when it was installed, execution time, and all that good stuff. And then you can see here it's ran my repeatable migration after the fact. And this is where the checksum for repeatables is a little bit different, because anytime you change a repeatable migration, it will compare that checksum that's in the database to the checksum that it generated based on the contents of the file, and rerun that file if that checksum has changed. So repeatables don't run over and over and over again. They just run anytime something changed. All right, so I'm going to create a new migration here. I'm going to add a new column to the data, to this customers table. Does anybody have any ideas for a column I could add? Email. All right. Add email column. And he was not a plant, just to be clear. That was a total random suggestion from the audience. I'm going to say alter table customers, add column email. I'm going to say, let's say somebody's got a monstrous email, and I'm just going to say like 1,000, right? Side note, did you know that apostrophes are valid in emails? How many people knew that? Handful. I didn't know that either, and yeah, apostrophes are valid in emails. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and add this email, and I'm going to run Docker compose up-d. Let that run here. So my database is already running, and it's going to reapply those migrations. So if I go ahead and run Docker compose logs again, you can see it said, hey, I migrated this. I'm currently on version 1, and I'm going to go ahead and apply version 2. And so it added that email column, and it successfully applied it. But let's just go ahead and go verify that. I'm going to refresh this here. And you can see, I've got a new column here of email, and it's got my varchar 1000 varchar. Heard it both ways. And if you go ahead and rerun this, the Flyway schema history table, you notice I've got another versioned record here as well. So let's go ahead and test the internet for real now and see how this works using GitHub Actions. I'm still connected to the internet, so that's good. I'm just going to go ahead and make a branch called email, and I'm going to say add email column. So that'll do a commit, push, and then create me a new pull request. So you can see here, again, the repo is just my first and last name, database-devops. You can follow along if you want. I've got, can everybody see that okay? Let me bump that up a little bit. It's good? All right. You can see here I've got the add column email. Everything's good to go. But let's say I've got a DBA involved, right? And you can, on this other screen over here, I am logged in as me, the DBA, right? And you can tell that because I'm not using a dark background. So if I'm the DBA here, I might be like, is 1,000 characters really necessary, right? And you can collaborate this way, and then come over here to my developer side, look at the conversation, maybe. Oh, I forgot to hit, I didn't hit add single comment, I hit create a review. All right, so then you can see I'm saying, hey, is 1,000 characters really necessary? And I'm gonna say yes, because reasons, right? And as the developer and the DBA is totally reasonable, unlike what somebody said earlier, and say, oh, okay, that makes sense. Reasons totally make sense. I'm gonna go ahead and say, approve this guy. And now as the developer, I can go ahead and squash and merge. And so I've got a database sitting out in Azure, a single database server that's got multiple databases on it, just single server just because I'm cheap. And it's got a development database and a production database. So if we come over here to Flyway, or to GitHub Actions running Flyway. So this is running Flyway Migrate. Again, you can go check out the source code if you want. This is just pulling down Docker and running Docker and applying Flyway to my development database is what this one is. And so you can see that it said, hey, I'm currently on version 1. Again, the exact same things we saw locally. I'm migrating to version 2, and I successfully applied that as well. And I've got it to automatically deploy to production, assuming development passes. And so it's deploying that out to production now as well. And everything is good to go. You notice it says pretty much the exact same thing. Not pretty much, the actual exact same thing. Something I forgot to show was we also were running this on the fly as well here in GitHub Actions. So on the pull request, I'm also running a verify that's basically running all my migrations in a Docker container as well. So you can see that everything's good to go as well. So I get some extra validation that, hey, everything's good to go. So if I go over to my Azure Databases, so look at dev here first. And this is going to heartbeat back to the US. So this might take a hot second. But I went from 3 columns here with the ID, first name, last name, to need like some music, to now having an email for development, and then the exact same thing for production as well, where if I refresh this, again, my email will show up there as well. So this was kind of showing you, like, taking those concepts that we applied, that we talked about earlier, and actually applying them by, like, getting DBAs involved, using tools like GitHub, and using tools like Flyway as well. So Flyway is really nice for things like when you do have DBAs involved or people who are more comfortable with SQL. If you are coming from like a C# .NET background, I would probably lean towards ND framework migrations most of the time. It just kind of depends on your scenario. Also, I would say Flyway is good for things like, if you got store procedures, functions, views, those kinds of things in your organization as well. All right. So that, go for it.
Is EF framework migration good even if you're not using entity framework?
So the question was, is entity framework migrations good even if you're not using entity framework? So it depends on, so entity framework definitely has a C# lean to it. So if your developers aren't C# focused, entity framework probably doesn't make too much sense. But if they are, you can absolutely use entity framework just for the migrations part of it, and not the ORM part of it. So you can totally do that if you so choose. It's just, if you're all in the entity framework, bought into the whole ecosystem, you get a little bit extra benefits where you can run, migrations and integration tests and things like that a little bit easier.
And does EF framework work for most databases, like you use Postgres there in your example?
Yep.
And Oracle and so forth, because Microsoft stuff tends to lean towards SQL Server.
Yep, so the question was, does any framework work with other database engines other than just SQL Server? So I've used it with SQL Server, Oracle, although I don't like to talk about my Oracle days, Postgres, and MySQL as well. And it's worked on all of those database engines for me. Cool. So some common gotchas building a database. We kind of touched on this earlier. You will pay for the choices that were made in your database. So again, things like linked servers, cross-database hopping. I've seen like people creating temp tables and stored procedures also causing issues as well if you're not cleaning those up. And if you have old stored procedures, views, functions that reference old tables or columns that no longer exist, those will have to be cleared out as well, because if you're trying to build a whole database from scratch, that will cause issues because database engines don't like that. As well as we touched on multi-tenant challenges earlier, if you have a multi-tenant environment where each customer has their own database, you might run into challenges there as well, especially if all of those databases aren't on the same schema, so you'll have to do some work to sync those up. All right, let's talk about rollbacks. So in my experience, rollbacks are usually not worth the headache for a few reasons. Like my first question of like, doing the one level higher thing of like, well, why did the database migration work in like dev, UAT, QA, whatever environments you have before production, but didn't work in production? And almost always it's a failure in either people or process, where somebody might have made a change directly to production, didn't cascade that down, or maybe you don't have, in your process, you don't have like a good test environment to test some of this stuff out. So that's like getting to the root cause of like, okay, why do you even need rollbacks in the first place? But then like, let's say you're in the situation where you're like, you kind of want to roll back. How do you roll back something that's destructive, right? So if you have like a drop or a delete or truncate or something like that, it's all contextual, because it's kind of like, hey, if you're going to roll back a delete statement, for instance, okay, I need to pull that from a backup, okay, and can you just migrate the data over, or are you going to have to restore the whole database? Okay, are you going to lose your records in between the time when you ran that migration and when you're actually executing this rollback? So like everything's super contextual. So we talk about those trade-offs, and instead what I like to do is roll forward. So whatever change you need to make to get things to work, I would just rather focus on rolling forward and fixing the actual problem and not actually worrying about rollbacks. But again, it's very contextual. Sometimes rollbacks do make sense. It's just that's not where I go to first. So the other thing you'll run into is people challenges, because DevOps is a mindset shift, just like Agile is a mindset shift, and things like test-driven development are mindset shifts. So the more you can force nobody has production write access, the better. If people have production read access, that could make sense depending on your company's scenarios, but I really don't like giving out production write access or like alter DDL permissions, because you can then force everything to go through the pipeline. You don't have people bypassing the pipeline. This person I call Danny the deployer. This is somebody I've seen in many organizations. When you don't force everything to go through the pipeline, if somebody still has those keys to the kingdom, they might decide like, hey, I'm not fully bought into this thing, or I have a hot fix that needs to go out to production quick. I'm just going to go directly to prod without source controlling it, and I'll add it back later, right? And inevitably, this usually almost always causes pain. So at the end of the day, devs and DBAs, again, about I think like a third or half the room had DBAs in their organization. Those two groups need to work together. And so sometimes there's tension there, right? So sometimes developers are like, hey, DBAs, we heard some people talk earlier, DBAs, just cause are the keys to the kingdom, they're just gatekeepers, that kinds of things. Meanwhile, on the flip side of it, DBAs are like, hey, developers don't know how to properly design databases, right? And so that's where some of that tension comes from. So some ways to cut through that tension is, again, focus on the customer, kind of like what we talked about with the DevOps quote earlier. Like at the end of the day, the reason why we're doing all this is to deliver software more reliably and more often, right? So if we can focus on that and constantly bring that back to the focus, I find that cuts through a lot of that tension. All right, so some takeaways from this. Hopefully you choose a migrations-based approach. You source control your database, auto-deploy those source control migrations, and some tools that you can use as well as some of the gotchas that you're going to run into, both technical and then process and people organizational-wise as well. those are some things to take away from this talk. So you can do this. It's not a question of can you do this because you have all the tools at your disposal to do this. It's really a question of want to, not can. It's does your organization actually want to do this? So we've got some links here. So a link to the GitHub with a project that we showed earlier. It's just, again, github.com, my first and last name, database-devops. So Regate's got some good blogs on database DevOps as well as the link to the State of Database DevOps survey that we talked about earlier. And then here's a YouTube video that's really good with Jeffrey Palermo and Paul Stovall talking about database DevOps. So with that, any questions? Yeah.
What happens when things go wrong? For instance, you showed with the flyway, the create table statement, if you have multiple create tables, for some reason, let's say you didn't have an extension like PT Crypto installed.
Yep.
You didn't have a broken state because those things don't happen transactionally. But
Yeah, so the question was, what happens when things go wrong? Like if, say, you've got multiple create table statements and one of them might rely on an extension that's not installed. So tools like Flyway, and you can configure this as well, will run each script in a transaction. So it'll either do the whole thing or not. So depending on how you want to group things too, you can say like, hey, you can either say group things like, hey, all the pending migrations, run all of them in a transaction. So either they all succeed or they all fail. Or you can say like break things out and say each migration is their own isolated transaction. Now, yep, go ahead. No, you're good.
DDL scripts, former DBA, sorry, DDL doesn't run in a transaction. It can't. So I'm wondering, I'm thinking about DDL, never mind, forget it.
Okay, no worries. You definitely can get into situations where you might have to change the schema history table depending on what happened. So you might have to, like, say you get all the way, you deploy it out and you get all the way to production, everything succeeded, but then production failed for whatever reason. Let's say that script was just like a poison pill script that could never complete. You might have to like mark that script as either it's been executed and then just kind of ignore it, or like clean up your lower environments to delete that script out of source control. So you can absolutely get into weird situations like that, depending on what's going on. Yeah. Yep. Yes. Yep. Yep. So the question was about, or the statement was more like any framework code first doesn't really work great when you have like store procedures, functions, views, that kind of thing. That's been my experience as well. So any framework is really good when you're just using tables, but if you have additional DDL in the mix, any framework doesn't work as well. So yeah, Flyway, you just deal with SQL scripts at the end of the day. So you could still use ND framework because any framework has the option to, I can't remember what the switch is, but there's a switch on the .NET EF CLI to output to SQL scripts instead of the C# migrations. So you could still use any framework to generate some of your SQL scripts when you're dealing with like tables and stuff like that. So that is an option as well. Yep. All right, come back. Yeah.
Flyway is like all just pure SQL scripts. If you want to manage static data, basically you've got to write your own script managing that static data, or
correct.
Is there a more structured way of dealing with that?
Yep. So the question was, when you're dealing with static data, do I have to write SQL scripts, or is there a more structured way? So you just write SQL scripts. They don't have anything, to my knowledge, that other than SQL scripts. So the same first. Yep. Go for it.
So going back to the decision between a model-based approach and a migration-based approach, right?
Yep.
I'd like to hear a bit more on that because, for example, thinking about these migrations, right? We have seen the demo with 3 of them, but obviously as time goes by and different developers are contributing to that, when you do this build validation, you can potentially have thousands of migrations that have to be run. And that's not necessarily the shortest path to the end state of the database.
Yep, absolutely.
And on top of that, for example, the fact that you cannot roll back to a control state or whatever, it's also in a way a consequence of using that migration-based approach, because if you were using a model-based approach, you have a version of the previous model, right?
Yep.
So the point of not using a model-based approach Is it more based on the fact that the tools that we have today are not mature enough, or is it a fundamental thing that should be avoided?
Okay, so there's a few questions in there. So it was really about like model-based approach, migration-based approach, talk more about some of the issues there. You touched on one of the drawbacks of migrations, which is like, eventually you just keep accumulating scripts because they're immutable. You don't really, you can't really change the version migrations after the fact. So you can, when that gets kind of unruly over time, you can flatten those out and re-baseline. And a lot of tools like Flyway, you can do that as well. So once you get to like, okay, we've got thousands of migrations here, whatever your tripping point is, you can re-baseline and flatten those out and get rid of those migrations. So that's one way to avoid that. Your other question was around, model-based approach, like is one of the challenges with it, like the tools aren't mature enough. I mean, some of those tools like DACPack, SQL Source Control, those have been around for a while. I'm just like, I'm a developer, I like having control, right? So model-based approaches, you lose a lot of that control. Like sometimes they have hooks that you can hook into things, but really I want that control, and like migrations give me that control, and I'm not gonna get surprised by what it does because it's gonna run the exact same migrations everywhere. So that's kind of why I lean towards migrations over model-based approach. Good? All right, yeah. You remembered your question? Perfect. Yep. Yeah, so the question was about ordering matters. So do you deploy your application and then run your migrations, or run migrations and then deploy your application? So this is where things get a little tricky. So I like to run my migrations first and then deploy my application. And I want to make sure that my application can handle like n-1 versions of the database. So like I don't do destructive changes like column renames, for instance. In that situation, I might add a new column, migrate the data over, and then repoint everything over, and then drop the column in a future migration after the application's been moved. That's obviously a lot more work, and it's also contextual, right? Like say you have an application that's just internal facing, it's only 8 to 5. There's an issue, maybe you are okay being down for 30 seconds or whatever the case may be after hours. So again, it's kind of contextual, but if you're in a 24/7 environment, like most of us are now, that's not really an option. So that's why I like having my applications being able to support previous versions of the database. So it's something I have to constantly keep in mind. Correct. So yeah, so if the database migration fails, then the new version of the application doesn't go out. But that's also where things get tricky, right? Like if you separate into separate repos, things get a lot trickier because usually you're not pointed at the same pipeline when you have separate repos. And there's just a lot more coordination that you have to do. So that's also why I like to keep those things integrated, because ultimately they are tightly coupled at the end of the day. Yeah?
So beyond the end of doing some migrations, you have your updated version of the database. I want to run some integration tests with the application, check
Yep.
everything works well. In that process, I usually add a ton of stuff to the database, screw things up a bit. Want to roll it back. I can get, when you've got your dev test prod environments, you can just restore your dev and test back to something. I'd love to get to a world where I can just spin up the database, use it, throw it away with the testing. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so the question was about how do I spin up essentially a production-like database on the fly, more or less. Is that your question? So that's where I really like tools like Docker. So I can just, I don't, actually I think I do have Postgres installed, but like I'm sure I don't have the exact version that I just used in the Flyway demo. I like spinning up Docker, applying migrations, and with Flyway, like I've done things like have it look in additional folders for local development. So you can tell it, hey, go look in this folder and apply the migrations over here. So if you have like a test data sample that you want to use, I've done things like that before, or like, before my integration test, like in so I've traditionally used C# XUnit, like a class fixture or something like that kind of runs before all the tests to set up the data how I want. So I've done things like that as well. But yeah, that's like a perfect use case for Docker where you can spin things up, throw it away when you're done, all that kind of stuff.
Just attach with the data with Docker volume.
Yep, yep. And, you know, it's not perfect though, because like, you know, let's say you've got, you know, hundreds of gigabytes of data in your production system. You probably aren't going to be able to replicate that locally. So figuring out what that subset of data, the scenarios that make sense for you, and doing sanitization, like all that kind of stuff, that's where a lot of that stuff comes in. So question, yeah.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. For the 2 terabyte database, is it a real test to be running on a Docker?
Yeah, so like anything, like, you know, if we're thinking about like the testing pyramid, right? And I know there's testing diamond, testing trophy, all that stuff now. But like, you know, unit tests give you the least amount of confidence. Integration tests give you more, and give you more, right? So like, I view that similarly. So, you know, maybe my Docker databases are more like unit tests, where like they give me the least amount of confidence, and then I might have like some more end-to-end tests that are actually running like smoke tests as I deploy to dev, test, and production, caring about like the scenarios that I'm worried about. Production gets a little iffy with smoke testing because you probably don't want to write data unless you've accounted that for your systems. But yeah, so I think finding that subset of data that makes sense. There's also various tools out there, like I know Redgate makes like SQL clone for SQL Server, where you can basically take an entire database more or less and clone it, but it just does like deltas, so it doesn't copy the whole 100 gigabytes. It just, I think by default it's like 100 megabytes or something, and then just does deltas. So that's another option as well. But again, that's kind of how I look at it, is it's kind of like the testing pyramid. Any other questions or anything somebody wants me to do a live demo of? Once, going twice. All right, thanks everybody.